I always begin this story with a simple question. When humanity first rose into the sky, could it have imagined that one day battles would unfold there, not between birds, but between machines made of metal, fire, and fear? The early 20th century was an age of romantics and fanatics of technological progress. In Paris, people still bought postcards of smiling aviators posing beside their biplanes, as if these contraptions were playful toys. In evening balls, fashionable ladies quoted Verlaine, while engineers in cafes debated the future of aviation. It will open the world to travel. It will unite continents. But less than a decade later, the sky would turn into a place where death had its own engine and its own serial number. In 1914, war in Europe lifted itself above the ground. For the first time, it gained a third dimension, the vertical one. History will never forget the moment when tiny winged specks appeared above the front lines, the first reconnaissance planes. At the start of the Great War, the sky remained relatively innocent. Aviation was still viewed as a curiosity, an engineering novelty. French Farmans and German Taubes flew slowly, unarmed, their mission purely observational, to look down, to report where enemy guns stood, where columns moved. It seemed that war and sky would remain separate realms. But humanity knows no boundaries. If someone can see the enemy from above, the enemy will inevitably want to shoot him down. Thus was born the concept of air warfare. In August 1914, the Germans first used aircraft to correct artillery fire near Liège. That same month, a French crew attempted to attack the enemy by hand, dropping steel rods and nuts from the cockpit. It looked comical. Yet inside this comedy, the seeds of a new age were already ripening. By the end of the year, all sides understood the air itself was a weapon. Attempts began to shoot at enemy reconnaissance planes with pistols and carbines. Soon someone had the idea to mount a machine gun, first awkwardly on the side, then through the propeller with a synchronizer. Thus, the fighter aircraft was born. Its purpose simple and terrifying: to rule the sky. The first true aerial victory took place on October 5, 1914, when a French Voisin under Joseph Franz shot down a German aviatik. It was the moment the world shifted from aerial romance to aerial killing. By 1915, a silhouette appeared over the front that would change the imagination of war forever: the Fokker Eindecker. Its synchronized machine gun fired through the propeller arc, granting Germany temporary dominance in the air. For months, enemy aviators were shot down by the dozens. Soldiers on the ground called it the harvest of death in the sky. The French responded by creating their own aces: Guynemer, Nungesser. The British had Albert Ball. The fighter pilot became a newspaper hero, a knight of a new era. Yet like every knightly myth, this one carried both brilliance and tragedy. By 1916, they fell from the sky by the hundreds, burned alive, torn apart by bullets, vanishing into clouds that returned only with a trail of smoke. Meanwhile, the sky became a laboratory of experiments. Over the front appeared observation balloons, huge tethered gas bags from which officers directed artillery. They were guarded by machine guns and aerial patrols. For fighter pilots, these balloons were both tempting targets and deadly traps. Beneath them hung steel cables, and around them spread barrage balloon defenses, a forest of wires capable of slicing wings apart. Pilots called them the Iron Woods. Flying over the front, one could see a strange dual reality. Below, the ground, the serpentine trenches. Above, another front made of string and floating mines. War gained two layers, subterranean and celestial. In these years, a new terror emerged, the terror of falling. Pilots had no parachutes. Command believed they undermined morale. When a plane caught fire, a pilot had two options: burn or jump. Witnesses wrote that on clear days one could sometimes see a solitary dark speck descending slowly, a pilot choosing air over flames. Air warfare turned the sky into a mirror of human ambition. It wasn't just engines that clashed there, but ideologies of progress itself. Europe, which only yesterday had believed in the brotherhood of nations and science as a path to peace, now looked upward and saw its own inventions killing each other. By 1917, the war reached its aerial climax. Night raids on cities began. London, Paris, Venice all felt for the first time what it meant to have a war without front lines. German Zeppelin airships drifted silently above rooftops before dropping bombs. They glided high, their shadows sliding across the moonlit sky, while the people below could only watch as fire fell. After the first Zeppelin raid on London in 1915, British newspapers wrote, "The enemy has come from the sky." It was a moment of psychological rupture, the first time civilians realized that they too were targets. Thus was born the concept of total war. Not only the soldier, but the child in a cradle was now within reach. And yet there was something magnificent within the horror. Aviators, like chemists on the ground or sailors in the depths, made death beautiful. And that was perhaps its most dangerous betrayal. A different sky awaits ahead, a night sky filled with searchlights and explosions, a sky in which cities, not soldiers, become primary targets. If the early years of air warfare were an age of pioneers, reckless, romantic, almost naive, then the second phase became something far darker. By 1916-1917, the sky over Europe dimmed. It no longer shimmered with the excitement of invention. Instead, it vibrated with the heavy pulse of engines, the sweep of searchlights, and the distant thump of explosions. The air had become a theater where nations tested not only technology, but fear itself. It was in this twilight that the night sky emerged as a new kind of battlefield, one without contours, where black silhouettes drifted like predators hunting in the void. Night flying had once been a miracle. By the middle of the war, it had become a necessity. The Great War taught humanity that darkness no longer promised safety. Paris learned this truth first. London learned it last. When German Zeppelins first glided above Europe's capitals, they accomplished something even poison gas could not. They broke the psychological contract between civilian life and the battlefield. The idea that the front could come to you, into your bedroom, to your window, was something entirely new. It violated the oldest assumption of war, that armies fought armies, and that civilians belonged to another world. But now the child in a cradle was as vulnerable as the soldier in a trench. When the first Zeppelin bombed Paris in March 1915, people looked heavenward as though some ancient titan had descended upon the city. The enormous cigar-shaped colossus, bathed in moonlight, seemed almost mythic, a leviathan that had learned to breathe fire. Zeppelins were slow, lumbering, almost medieval in their grace, but they carried within them a terrifying modernity. Their bombs were small, their accuracy poor, but the psychological impact was immense. Citizens awoke at night to the hum of engines, and that metallic drone in the darkness felt more sinister than any artillery barrage. After the first raid on London, British newspapers declared, "The city no longer sleeps under God's sky, but under the sky of war." And they were right. The air itself had become weaponized. But technology, like war, evolves fast. Soon the Zeppelins were joined by new predators, Gotha bombers, German long-range aircraft capable of crossing the Channel. They came not as solitary wanderers, but in formation, dark arrows slicing through the clouds. They did not drift, they descended with intention. During the Great Gotha Raid of June 1917, bombs fell on a London primary school. 18 children were killed. And in that single moment, the British Empire understood. The sky was no longer a romantic arena for daring aces. It was now a zone of national vulnerability. Britain responded by building the first coordinated air defense network in human history. Chains of observation posts, sound locating devices, anti-aircraft guns, and, above all, the great stitched web of searchlights. If the ground resembled a scarred wasteland, the night sky now resembled an experimental laboratory of light. Searchlights, those white spears, became some of the war's most haunting icons. At night, they crossed like dueling swords, carving slices of brilliance into the darkness. Pilots compared them to white fingers probing the heavens. A Gotha flying above London in 1917 would have seen a strange vista: a blacked-out city, the faint silver line of the Thames, and dozens of searchlights weaving geometric shapes across the sky, as if some giant hand were drawing in slow motion. German aviators feared the beams more than bullets. Once trapped in a cone of light, a bomber became a perfect silhouette, a dark crucifix suspended in mid-air. Anti-aircraft gunners no longer fired blindly. They aimed at a target etched by light. The air above London became a duel between mathematics and instinct. But beneath this illuminated sky, the first night fighters were emerging. If daylight belonged to the aces, the night belonged to the patient. Early night fighters had no radar, no electronic aids, nothing that could penetrate darkness. They relied on moonlight, the faint glow of exhaust flames, and pure chance. Pilots called it fencing in total blindness. Imagine two aircraft, both half invisible, both hunting each other in a three-dimensional void. The one who glimpsed even a spark first won. The one who did not fell. It was during these nocturnal duels that the sky ceased to be merely a physical space, but became a psychological phenomenon, a medium of dread enveloping both soldiers and civilians. At the same time, humanity was discovering that the air was not simply a battlefield, but a corridor, a pathway through which war could slip behind enemy lines. Bombing was no longer an experiment, it was becoming a doctrine. Factories, railway yards, ports, all became legitimate targets. For the first time since the Mongol catapults, civilians realized they were pieces on the strategic chessboard. Air warfare democratized fear. And yet, parallel to fear, fascination grew. Newspapers published portraits of pilots seated in their cockpits like knights in steel saddles. Children in London and Berlin collected postcards of their heroes. Even as bombs destroyed homes, the myth of the aviator, noble, courageous, free, persisted. Pilots wrote surprisingly philosophical reflections in their diaries. They felt like pioneers, or like the condemned. One British night fighter captured the mood perfectly. The sky at night is neither friend nor foe. It is a mirror. In it, you see only yourself, magnified by the terror of altitude. By late 1917, the air war had become something the world had never experienced. A constant struggle over altitude, darkness, psychology, and technology. The sky over Europe no longer resembled the heavens of poets. It resembled the dim, humming ceiling of an immense industrial factory. Machines hunted machines. Searchlights hunted shadows. Fear hunted everyone. But the transformation was not complete. The next phase would be darker still. The birth of strategic bombing as an ideology. The moment when generals began to believe that destroying cities could break nations. And once that idea took root, the 20th century learned a new truth. If ground war devours bodies, air war devours civilizations. There is a moment in every great technological shift when humanity crosses an invisible threshold, a point beyond which the old rules no longer apply. In air warfare, that moment came when military thinkers stopped asking whether cities could be bombed and began asking how effectively they could be destroyed. If the first phase of aerial combat was born from improvisation and the second from fear, then the third was born from cold calculation. By 1917-1918, the sky had become an abstract arena, a chessboard suspended above nations. Generals who once commanded infantry squares and cavalry lines now found themselves commanding formations of shadowy insects that could leap across borders. The bomber became not merely a machine, but an idea. The idea that strength could be projected not against armies, but directly against societies. This shift did not happen overnight. It grew from the soil of industrial logic, a logic that whispered, if war is total, then the destruction must be total too. The first theorists of strategic bombing were not monsters. They were men shaped by the catastrophe of trench warfare, men who saw ridges soaked in blood and concluded, wrongly, tragically, that a different method of killing might be more humane. Break the enemy's will, they argued. Strike their factories, their railways, their power. Paralyze their capacity to fight. In the abstract, it sounded rational, but abstractions have a way of ignoring the people who live beneath them. The British theorist Hugh Trenchard argued that air power could bypass the trenches entirely, striking directly at the vital organs of the enemy. German thinkers like von Eberhard and von Höppner echoed similar thoughts. The idea spread quickly, like a contagion. Generals looked at maps not as landscapes, but as grids of vulnerabilities. Cities became nodes, nodes became targets, targets became acceptable. And the sky, once a symbol of aspiration, became a ledger of calculations. One has to imagine the experience of those who first witnessed this transformation. Civilians who had never seen a battlefield, but who suddenly found themselves thrust onto its coldest edge. Londoners, when the Gothas came, did not see themselves as soldiers, but the bombs did not care about distinctions. They fell on bakeries, apartment blocks, river docks, schoolyards. A single raid in 1917 left bodies scattered like punctuation across a page of history that was being rewritten without consent. In one diary, a London nurse wrote, "I had thought war was something that happened 100 miles away, but tonight the war came through the roof." The German civilian experience was different, not because they were spared, but because their fear grew in anticipation. British retaliatory raids, small and clumsy at first, soon matured into more coherent operations. When British bombers struck Mannheim and Friedrichshafen, Germany felt for the first time the tremor of responsibility for the machine it had helped unleash. Even the French, whose early aviation philosophy had enforced finesse, and finesse alone, joined the doctrine. Their Breguet and Voisin bombers crossed the lines repeatedly in the war's final year, each raid a statement that no place, no person, no building was sacred. Thus Europe entered the age of reciprocal terror. The night sky itself changed character. It grew tension, like a string pulled tight. Cities lay in enforced darkness, hoping to make themselves invisible, as if modesty could hide them from destruction. The blackout was a strange social experiment. Every lamp extinguished, every window shuttered, every street dimmed until the metropolises of enlightenment resembled medieval towns waiting for marauders. Children slept in cellars. Families ate supper in silence, ears tuned to the distant drone of engines. Factories worked behind covered windows, their glow cloaked as if ashamed. Above them, the bombers crawled across the night like metallic constellations. The sky was no longer God's canvas. It was an equation. The bombs themselves were primitive, flimsy casings filled with metal fragments, often inaccurate and unreliable, yet they carried more than explosives. They carried psychological mass. A trench explosion kills those nearby. A bombing raid kills those far from the front and terrifies millions more. It introduced a new kind of fear, almost philosophical, the fear of arbitrary annihilation, delivered without warning, without motive, without reason. In medieval warfare, enemies were visible: horsemen, infantry, siege towers. In the industrial age, they were hidden behind horizons, artillery far beyond sight. But in air warfare, the enemy became invisible until the moment of impact. This was something new. This was something pure and cold. The 20th century would learn to live with this fear, but the Great War was the century's first lesson. It was during this period that military planners took their most fateful step. They began to consider the mass bombing of cities not as an improvisation, but as a possible strategy for ending war altogether. If people suffer enough, some argued, they will demand peace. It was a seductive logic, the kind that only seems reasonable when one forgets the humanity behind the statistics. In 1918, the British formed the Independent Air Force, the world's first strategic bombing arm. Its purpose was clear: to strike deep into Germany, to terrorize war industries, to break morale. The Germans planned similar campaigns with their Riesenflugzeuge, giant bombers that looked like flying cathedrals of steel. The idea was intoxicating: end the war by suffocating the enemy's will from above. But ideas, once liberated, cannot be easily caged. There is an irony here, a bitter one. Even as these doctrines evolved, the war was nearing its end. The 100 Days Offensive, the collapse of the German lines, the armistice, all unfolded before strategic bombing could prove decisive. Yet the doctrine endured. It survived the peace. It seeped into the minds of future generals. It sat quietly in the back rooms of military academies, waiting. In the post-war years, the Weimar Republic studied these ideas obsessively. Britain and France debated them with a mixture of fascination and unease. The United States, untouched by aerial terror in 1914-18, embraced them with evangelical conviction. Thus, the Great War became not only the birthplace of air combat, but also the seedbed of everything that air power would become in the century that followed. And in that seed already lay the dark blossom of future wars: Rotterdam, Guernica, Warsaw, London, Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, Hiroshima. The doctrine was young in 1918, but it was alive. And it was hungry. Yet before this doctrine could mature, the war turned toward its final year, a year in which the air war would fuse with the ground war into a single, brutal organism. For in 1918, the skies over Europe were no longer simply a battlefield. They were the nervous system of the conflict, a system pulsing with reconnaissance, disruption, bombing, counterbombing, and a new kind of mechanized vision. And it was here, above the trenches of Picardy and Flanders, that humanity witnessed the next transformation, the fusion of air power with the massive ground offensives that would bring the Great War to its breaking point. By 1918, the war no longer separated its elements. Sky and earth, once distinct arenas, melted into a single organism of violence. The trenches below and the heavens above became intertwined nerves of the same monstrous body, twitching, bleeding, reacting. If earlier the air war had been a separate drama of duels, raids, and experiments, then in 1918 it became the bloodstream of the conflict itself. The final year of the Great War was a storm, and the air learned to strike with the precision and savagery of that storm. The year began with a catastrophe that few on the Allied side expected: Operation Michael, the German spring offensive. It was a blow conducted with the logic of desperation. Russia had fallen. The Eastern Front had vanished. Germany, suddenly freed from a two-front war, transferred nearly 1 million men westward. Ludendorff believed he had a narrow window, a season perhaps, to crush the British before American troops arrived in force. The Germans attacked not just with infantry, but with something new: tactical integration. Stormtroopers led the way, but above them roared squadrons of German aircraft, the Jagdstaffeln, darting through the mist like steel insects. For the first time, air power was not merely support, it was a partner. German planes strafed trenches to paralyze communication. They hunted observation balloons with ferocity. They dropped small fragmentation bombs on crossroads to tangle retreating columns. The earth shook from artillery, but the sky trembled with just as much violence. British troops reported that during the March assault, the air was black with crosses. The RC, soon to become the RAF, lost hundreds of aircraft in mere weeks. Some airfields were overrun on the ground by advancing Germans. It was as if the war had tilted, pitching everything westward. And yet, even as the German tide surged, a subtle reversal was beginning. For while Germany could mass troops, it could not mass time. The clock had turned against it. Behind the lines, American squadrons were arriving, raw, inexperienced, but numerous. French factories were still producing engines at a pace Germany could not match. And the RAF was learning a new form of discipline, replacing the chivalric ethos of earlier years with something colder, more methodical. By late spring, the Allies were reclaiming the sky by sheer momentum. Air war is an economy. Whoever invests more steel, more fuel, more pilots ultimately wins altitude. In April, the Royal Air Force was officially born, the first independent air force in the world. Its creation was symbolic. Nations now believed air power was so essential that it required autonomy. The sky had become sovereign. During the German offensives, one battlefield revealed this new fusion with almost surgical clarity: Villiers-Bretonneux, the site of the first tank versus tank battle, yes, but also one of the first fully integrated air-ground clashes in modern history. Above the burning fields, aircraft swarmed like hornets. German Albatros and Pfalz fighters attacked low, strafing Australian and British defenders. British Sopwith Camels dropped tiny bombs onto German infantry assembling for renewed pushes. Observation planes hovered at the very edge of safety, calling out targets like eyes embedded in the sky. The air war was no longer a duel between gentlemen. It was now a systolic pulse of the army, pumping information downward and destruction upward. One Australian officer wrote, "The earth no longer speaks without the sky answering, and the sky no longer moves without the earth trembling." He was not wrong. If Operation Michael was a violent sunrise, Amiens was noon, bright, merciless, decisive. August 8, 1918. Ludendorff would call it the Black Day of the German army. Not because the Germans lacked courage, but because the Allies displayed something terrifying: true combined arms warfare. Tanks, infantry, artillery, and aviation moved like parts of one organism. It was the prototype of a doctrine that would dominate the next World War, a doctrine born not in 1939, but here, in the battered wheat fields near Amiens. Before dawn, the air above the Allied lines vibrated with the engines of nearly 2,000 aircraft. British DH-9 bombers, French Breguet 14s, and newly operational American squadrons swarmed skyward. As the creeping barrage advanced, Allied tanks rolled behind it, and above them in a perfect tier flew air cover. Fighters dove in on machine gun nests seconds before tanks reached them. Reconnaissance aircraft updated positions in real time, adjusting the artillery mat as if the front were a living, moving machine. The German diary entries from that morning read like laments. "They are everywhere. in the sky, on the ground, all at once. For the first time, German infantry felt what it was like to be attacked from every angle of the compass and from every dimension of space. The air war was no longer an accessory, it was the architecture of victory. But the skies above Amiens concealed something deeper, a philosophical shift. For centuries, armies had moved with the speed of horses and the patience of seasons. But now, with engines thundering above and below, war suddenly felt accelerated. Time itself sped up. Decisions took minutes, not days. Movements occurred in hours, not weeks. A pilot flying reconnaissance in 1918 glimpsed a future where war would be defined not by territory, but by velocity. One American observer wrote, "Everything moves so fast that the Earth cannot understand what the sky is doing." The future was arriving, loud, metallic, unstoppable. Even as the Allies advanced, the air war grew more ruthless. The RAF began systematically bombing German supply lines, railway junctions, and troop concentrations. French bombers hit bridges, depots, factories. Germany, strangled by blockade and shortages, could no longer respond effectively. Its aircraft dwindled, its fuel ran thin, its pilots were exhausted. By September, the German air service was fighting on inertia alone. By October, even the legendary aces, those who had defined the early war, were falling one by one. Above a collapsing empire, the sky itself seemed to sag. And yet, in these last months, something strangely human emerged. Pilots on both sides, sensing the war's end, wrote letters with a tenderness rare in wartime diaries. One British flyer wrote, "We are not fighting men now. We are fighting the wind, the noise, the exhaustion. The Germans are no longer our enemy, distance is." Another, a German Ufts, scribbled on the eve of the armistice, "I no longer fear the enemy. I fear that the sky will forget me when the war is over." The pilots, like the trenches below, were becoming historical relics even before the guns fell silent. When the armistice finally arrived on November 11, 1918, the airfields became quiet plains of rusting wood and canvas. Propellers slowed to stillness. Engines that once roared across continents now cooled in the morning frost. But something irreversible had happened. The war had created not just aircraft, but air power, a concept as potent and volatile as dynamite. The sky had proven its strategic value, and nations, intoxicated by that new power, would never again relinquish it. The Great War ended, but the sky did not return to innocence. It would never return. For above the charred forests, the collapsed trenches, the abandoned balloon stations, a new reality hovered. That war had found its second home, a domain where borders are meaningless, where height is strength, and where the next conflict would not begin on land or sea, but in the thin blue air. History has a peculiar habit. When a great disaster ends, people do not breathe freely, they dream. And after 1918, humanity dreamed of the sky. The Great War had carved a rift in the world's memory, a kind of civilizational scar. But from that wound emerged something uncanny, the belief that the future belonged not to the ground, not to the sea, but to the air. The pilot, once a fragile daredevil clinging to canvas and wooden spars, now walked like a conqueror. The airplane, once a novelty, now carried the aura of destiny. It was an illusion. A magnificent, dangerous illusion. But illusions often govern the world more powerfully than truths. What followed in the 1920s was not peace. It was incubation. In the months after the armistice, thousands of aircraft stood silently on muddy airfields across France and Belgium. The winter of 1918 to 1919 froze them into strange pale sculptures, Sopwith Camel stiff with frost, Fokkers sagging under snow, RE-8s and Breguet bombers glazed like relics in ice. Mechanics who once worked 16 hours a day wandered through these graveyards of canvas and aluminum, touching wings with the reverence one gives to tombstones. Pilots who survived the final offensives walked between rows of abandoned machines as if revisiting their own memories, memories of fire, speed, triumph, terror. Some of them could not adjust to silence. The pounding of engines had become the rhythm of their blood. In Germany, ace pilots returned to homes that no longer recognized them. The Kaiser was gone, the old empire dissolved. What remained was a fragile republic, trembling between poverty and rage. Many pilots found no work, no purpose, and no peace. The sky had given them an identity, and the earth took it away. One former Jagdstaffel pilot wrote bitterly in his journal, "We flew above nations. Now we stand in breadlines." Yet in this bitterness, a seed was sprouting, a nostalgia for the sky that would soon be weaponized by politics. Elsewhere, theorists sharpened their pencils. The battlefield was quiet, but the lecture halls were loud. In Britain, Hugh Trenchard, now the first chief of the air staff, insisted on a radical idea that air power alone could decide future wars. Bomb the enemy's factories, his railroads, his cities, his morale, and the nation would collapse before its armies ever fired a shot. It was a seductive argument for a country exhausted by trench warfare. Trenchard promised victory without Passchendaele, without Verdun, without Somme. He believed an air force could strike the heart of a nation directly, bypassing the shield of armies. It was a doctrine of abstraction, terrifying in its simplicity. France embraced a similar prophet, the intellectual and visionary Giulio Douhet. His book, The Command of the Air, argued that the bomber was the supreme instrument of war, more important than infantry, armor, or naval power. He declared, "The bomber will always get through." It became one of the most influential and most catastrophic predictions in modern military history. For what began as theory soon hardened into policy. In Weimar Germany, where humiliation and economic collapse formed the daily atmosphere, the air war of 1914 to 1918 became a myth, not of defeat, but of possibility. The German General Staff, though forbidden from owning combat aircraft under the Treaty of Versailles, quietly funded commercial aviation ventures that were little more than disguised training schools. Pilots practiced acrobatics under the pretense of civil flying. Technicians tested engines in hidden workshops. Students studied foreign journals on bombing and air strategy as if reading forbidden scriptures. The future Luftwaffe began as a ghost, invisible, illegal, but palpably real. And beneath all of this lay a societal longing, the belief that the humiliation of 1918 could be reversed not by armies trudging through mud, but by aircraft sweeping across the sky like avenging angels. The myth of the sky became the myth of national resurrection. Meanwhile, the United States, which had entered the war late, experienced the air conflict not as tragedy, but as revelation. American pilots had tasted only the final year of the war, the energy, the momentum, the technological thrill. For them, aviation was associated not with despair, but with possibility. The U.S. Army Air Service emerged from the war with a conviction bordering on religious zeal. Air power was the future, and America, with its vast industry and untouched homeland, was destined to command it. Even civilians felt the pull. Newspapers published glamorous photos of returning aviators, young, handsome, confident, symbols of American modernity. In New York cafes, people spoke not of trenches, but of altitude, horsepower, new alloys, and newly imagined frontiers. The Great War had ended. The next sky had already begun. But beneath all this idealism brewed something more troubling, the illusion of a new kind of war, one fought not between armies, but between entire societies. A war without battlefields, a war without trenches, a war where cities replaced forts and civilians replaced soldiers. This illusion derived from a subtle misunderstanding of 1914 to 1918. People believed that air power could have won the war decisively if only it had been larger, faster, more organized. Thus, the tragedy of the past became the blueprint of the future. If the last war did not defeat the enemy fast enough, the next war, they believed, would do so within weeks before infantry even mobilized. The dream was intoxicating and dangerous. Meanwhile, in the shadows, amidst social revolutions and economic despair, another transformation was underway, a cultural one. Artists painted the sky as a fractured metallic place. Poets wrote of machines with souls. Philosophers compared the airplane to a symbol of modernity, a bridge between man and gods. Marinetti celebrated speed and violence in the futurist manifestos. Gropius envisioned a world shaped by aviation and geometry. Wyndham Lewis and Paul Nash painted landscapes where machines devoured nature. The airplane ceased to be a machine. It became a metaphor for modernity, for ambition, for total war. Society was being prepared, gently, subtly, to accept the sky not as a sanctuary, but as a battlefield. And then there were the veterans, the silent carriers of the future storm. Some returned broken, unable to sleep without hearing engines in the dark. Others returned restless, craving the altitude that had once lifted them above the misery of the earth. Some wrote memoirs, glorifying the nightly duels of the Great War. Others taught in flight schools. A few enlisted in political movements that promised to restore aviation to its rightful place at the heart of national pride. The sky offered them meaning when the earth offered none. In this mixture of pride, resentment, idealism, fear, technological euphoria, and historical misinterpretation, the blueprint of the next war was already taking shape. But the world did not yet understand it. It did not understand that the ideas Trenchard and Duhet sketched on paper would one day be carved into the firestorms over Guernica, Warsaw, London, Hamburg, Tokyo. It did not understand that the ghosts of 1918 were silently assembling the arsenals of 1939. It did not understand that the sky, once a place of doves, was becoming a kingdom of iron. The illusion of air power supremacy, seductive, elegant, catastrophic, was blooming, and soon that illusion would demand a reckoning. There comes a moment in every conflict when its weapons cease to be experiments and become instruments. For the air war of the Great War, that moment was 1917. By then, the sky over Europe had hardened. It no longer resembled the frontier of pioneers. It had become an industrial battlefield, a place where technology, fear, exhaustion, and genius collided in every cubic meter of air. The pilots who rose into that sky knew one truth. The war on the ground had stalled, so the war above must break free. And so the air war transformed, not by chance, but by desperation. 1917 opened with a kind of aerial fever. New engines, new machine guns, new tactics. Nations poured their last strength into conquering a dimension they barely understood. The British brought the XIII and the Sopwith Camel, temperamental, deadly machines that punished the inexperienced and rewarded the bold. The French fielded the SPAD-7 and XIII, flying spears built around strong Hispano-Suiza engines. Germany, whose air service had once ruled the sky under the banner of the Fokker Scourge, now fought for survival, developing the Albatros D3, the D5, and eventually the Fokker Dr.I, the triplane, beloved by Manfred von Richthofen. It was not a battle of romance anymore. It was a battle of industry. Planes were no longer wooden skeletons, tied together with optimism and linen. They were steel engines, with wings attached. And the sky felt it. The pilots felt something else as well, the pressure of death, tightening like altitude around the lungs. In 1915 and 1916, aerial duels often involved hesitation, even a shred of chivalry. By 1917, mercy had vanished. Machine guns had synchronized firing, tactics had matured, survival demanded ruthlessness. Spring 1917, remembered by the British as Bloody April, became the clearest sign of this change. The Royal Flying Corps, supporting the Arras offensive, flew outdated machines, BE-2s and FE-2s, into skies dominated by the Albatros fighters of Jagdgeschwader I, the Flying Circus. The result was slaughter.
The RFC lost more than 300 aircraft in a month. Pilots lasted an average of 9 days. Yet the survivors did not break. The horror forged them. A British lieutenant wrote after watching a friend fall in flames, "We have no choice but to go back up. The ground is already lost to despair, only the sky remains to redeem us." That sentence captured the essence of the air war in 1917, a doomed struggle that felt sacred.
Balloon busting, once a reckless stunt, became a science. Observation balloons were now the nervous system of the front. Destroying them meant blinding the enemy. But they were guarded by machine guns, anti-aircraft batteries, patrolling fighters, and above all, the dreadful barrage balloon defenses, an invisible forest of cables ready to tear wings apart. Pilots called those zones death gardens. Yet men volunteered anyway, because to destroy a balloon was to protect thousands below. French ace Georges Guillemer once wrote, "It is not the balloon that terrifies, it is the sky around it." He died before the end of the year, lost, not found. By 1918, the air war had merged with the ground war into a single, synchronized organism. It was no longer a duel of lone knights. It was a vast, coordinated system of machines and men, all bound by the same invisible wind. The German spring offensive, the final gamble of a nation stretched to breaking, showcased this new reality. Low-flying German aircraft strafed trenches, shredded barbed wire, and disrupted communications. British and French fighters responded immediately, fighting so close to the ground that infantrymen could see their faces twisted in effort. From above, the battlefield looked like a chessboard of smoke. From below, the sky looked like a burning ceiling. The level of integration was unprecedented. Reconnaissance planes spotted breakthroughs. Artillery aircraft adjusted fire in real time. Fighters protected ground troops. Bombers hit supply lines in crossroads. Balloon observers relayed urgent corrections. The war had become a storm, and the sky was at its center. Meanwhile, night bombing became a discipline of its own. Zeppelins, once symbols of German pride, were now hunted into extinction by new defensive measures. But heavier than air bombers took their place: German Gothas, Handley Pages, French Breguet. Cities could now be struck not by floating giants, but by roaring engines under cover of darkness. Searchlights and anti-aircraft guns threaded the sky with white and red geometry. Pilots navigated by moonlight and instinct alone. A German pilot described night bombing as flying through ink, guided only by the trembling of the machine. Night in 1918 was not peaceful. It was a stage for shadows and flame. But nothing defined the final phase of the air war more than exhaustion. Pilots were not machines, yet they lived as if they were. Many flew 3, 4, even 5 missions a day. Some aged 10 years between spring and autumn. Others simply faded, not shot down, but drained. The war demanded everything. The sky demanded more. In the summer of 1918, ace René Fonck wrote, "We do not fight for victory anymore. We fight because the sky will not let us stop." And then, suddenly, it stopped. When the armistice came on November 11, 1918, the engines fell silent. The sky became empty again. But the silence felt unnatural, as if the air itself had grown used to violence and now missed the thunder. Pilots stepped from their machines like men returning from another planet. Some cried, some laughed, some could not look at the sky at all. The air war had lasted only 4 years, but it had dragged humanity 4 centuries into the future. The world that entered 1914 with balloons and pistols left 1918 with synchronized machine guns, formation tactics, aerial bombing, and industrial fighter squadrons. The sky, once untouched,
had been remade by human ambition, and it would never be innocent again. There is a cruel irony in the story of the First World War. The men who fought in the clean, cold air above the mud were often the ones most scarred by what they saw. The infantry lived in the earth, the artillery lived in thunder, but the aviators lived between worlds, too high to belong to the living, too mortal to join the sky. If the earlier chapters described the machines and the battles, then this chapter belongs to the hearts that beat behind every engine. For the air war was not only a technological revolution, it was a psychological one. The first aviators of 1914 entered the war with a kind of naive heroism. They were explorers of the vertical frontier, riding fragile frames woven from wood and linen. In their minds, flight was still a form of poetry, but the war wrote a different poem. At first, pilots felt exhilaration, the freedom of altitude, the silence above the guns, the illusion of control. They described flight with metaphors of birds, angels, liberation. Yet, as the war deepened, the metaphors changed. The sky, once imagined as a cathedral, became a cage of wind and bullets. A French observer wrote, "We found heaven and discovered that it too had trenches." What separated aviators from the men in the trenches was not courage. That existed everywhere, but the peculiar loneliness of their battlefield. A pilot could die without a witness. He could fall in silence, spiraling through clouds, vanishing into forest or wasteland or swamp. His body might never be recovered. His machine might burn unseen. He fought alone, even when flying in formation. This solitude shaped them. It made some philosophical, others fatalistic, a few quietly broken. An RC pilot confessed in a letter, "I fear the silence more than the shells. In a crater, your friends die beside you. Up here, you die where no one can hear you scream." The stress was relentless. Every sortie meant the possibility of death by fire, the most feared fate in the air. Parachutes were not issued to Allied pilots. Command believed they encouraged cowardice. Thus, men flew knowing that if fuel tanks ignited, the cockpit became a furnace. German pilots received parachutes in 1918, late, imperfect, unreliable, and the Allies resented their existence, not out of jealousy, but because it reminded them of their own vulnerability. A British pilot wrote bitterly, "We strap ourselves to our cremation." It was not an exaggeration. Fear became a constant companion, not the sudden fear of battle, but a slow, chronic, eroding fear. Pilots developed what they called the twitch, a condition where nerves misfired, hands shook, or vision blurred. Some experienced nightmares of falling, the sensation of endless descent. Others felt trapped on the ground, unable to breathe unless inside a cockpit. A few refused to fly and were quietly reassigned. Most returned to the sky anyway. They flew because they had to, because others depended on them, because they did not want to abandon comrades. But some flew because the sky itself had become their addiction. In this strange realm of terror and beauty, aces emerged not because they sought glory, but because they mastered survival. Manfred von Richthofen, Albert Ball, René Fonck, Georges Guynemer, Edward Manock, each became myth, but each lived with dread. Richthofen wrote late in the war, "I am tired. The sky is the same every day. Only the dead change." Albert Ball, the British ace, idolized by newspapers, wrote, "I cannot bear this much longer. The world below seems so peaceful from above. It feels like I am killing it." Guynemer, the beloved French hero, disappeared into the clouds in September 1917, leaving no grave, no wreck, no farewell. Manock,
Arguably the RAF's deadliest pilot, taught his students never fly straight, never hesitate, and never think too long about tomorrow. He was killed weeks before the armistice. Their myth suggests invulnerability. Their letters reveal fragility. Yet not all feelings were dark. Amid the terror, many found transcendence, moments of clarity unreachable on Earth. A pilot climbing through sunrise described the sky as a kingdom untouched by war, though stained by it. Another wrote, "Above the clouds, it feels as if we are what humanity was meant to become." This contradiction, horror intertwined with beauty, haunted their memories. The sky gave them perspective. The war took everything else. Camaraderie in the air services was unlike anything on land. Pilots ate together, trained together, risked death together. They lived with intensity because tomorrow was not guaranteed. Their huts and barracks were filled with laughter, arguments, piano music, letters from home, small rituals before flight. They carved names on tables, photographed each other constantly, shared superstitions, lucky scarves, lucky charms, lucky routines. Some decorated their machines with personal symbols, hearts, skulls, crosses, animals, initials. They were not flamboyant gestures, but claims of identity in a war that stripped identity away. Every squadron had ghosts, empty chairs, silent beds, untouched mugs. No one removed them. No one could. By the beginning of 1918, the war had consumed almost everything: landscapes, empires, youth, illusions, but there was one frontier it had not yet exhausted: the sky. This final year transformed aerial warfare from a collection of scattered innovations into a unified force, a force capable of shaping entire campaigns. The sky was no longer an accessory, nor a laboratory, nor a stage for duels. It had become a weapon of strategy. And in this last chapter of the war's violence, the air war reached its most intense, coordinated, and devastating form. The first tremor of this shift came with Germany's spring offensive, the largest operation it had mounted since 1914, when Ludendorff hurled his stormtroopers across the fog-filled front in March 1918. The German air service did not merely support the attack, it enabled it. Low-flying German fighters and Schlchtwaffen strafed trenches, shattered communication lines, and turned the front into a crawling chaos. Observation aircraft guided every stage of the advance. Bomber squadrons struck railway hubs behind British lines, tearing apart the arteries that fed the front. It was the first time in history that an offensive on the ground felt choreographed by the sky. A British corporal wrote, "We fought the Germans with rifles. They fought us with the air." This was no longer the air war of 1915. It was coordinated, relentless, systemic. But the German offensive carried within it a paradox. It proved air power's strength precisely as Germany's own strength began to collapse. Fuel shortages, pilots' exhaustion, aging aircraft, the long attrition of the blockade. A sky that once belonged to Germany began slipping away. And into that widening sky stepped a force the Allies had waited for: American aviation. The arrival of the American expeditionary forces injected new blood into a sky that had grown old. At first, American pilots flew French machines, the nimble Nieuport 28, the powerful Spad 13. But what mattered more than the equipment was the energy: raw, aggressive, fearless, often disundisciplined, but undeniably disruptive. They joined the British and French in massive offensive sweeps, called barrage patrols, that sought to dominate entire sectors of airspace. They learned from veterans, adapted quickly, and brought a sense of momentum to the Allied cause. One French officer wrote, "They arrived like the future, noisy, eager, untamed." And the future was exactly what was needed. As summer approached, the air war became a kind of continuous storm. From Flanders to the Marne,
From Amiens to Somme, entire battlefields pulsed with the vertical motion of squadrons rising and falling. The Battle of Amiens in August 1918, often called the beginning of the end, was the clearest example of the sky's new dominion. For the first time in the war, the Allies unleashed a full orchestration of air power. Fighters flew continuous top cover over advancing infantry. Bombers pulverized roads, bridges, and supply dumps behind German lines. Ground attack aircraft roared at treetop height, scattering troops and horses. Observation planes updated artillery maps in real time. Balloon observers directed counter-battery fire with unprecedented accuracy. Camels and Spads intercepted German reinforcements before they reached the battlefield. It was not merely air support, it was air supremacy. German diaries from that week often read like laments. The sky is theirs, it follows us. Yet even in this moment of Allied dominance, the price paid by aviators was merciless. Pilots flew 4, sometimes 5 sorties a day. Engines overheated, fuel leaked, guns jammed, arms went numb from holding control sticks against shuddering wind. Some pilots aged visibly in a matter of weeks. Many simply disappeared, lost in clouds, swallowed by forests, consumed in flames. The sky had become a graveyard without markers. September and October 1918 brought the last great convulsions of the air war. The Battle of Somme, the first major American-led offensive, showcased a level of aerial coordination no army had ever attempted. Over 1,400 Allied aircraft, fighting, observing, bombing, patrolling. It was a demonstration of what the next century would later perfect. Combined arms shaped from above. 3 weeks later, at the Meuse-Argonne, the largest air operation of the entire war erupted. German pilots, exhausted and outnumbered, fought with desperate brilliance. Allied pilots, energized and ambitious, pushed relentlessly. The sky shook with duels, formations, spirals of tracer fire, collapsing wings, burning engines. Planes fell so often that infantrymen began referring to them as fallen angels. A German sergeant near Cunel wrote, "The heavens are sick, they spit fire." And then, abruptly, the crescendo weakened. By November, German squadrons were shells of their former selves. Fuel was rationed, engines misfired. Pilots were down to their last reserves of strength. The Allies prepared for another great aerial thrust. It never came, because the war ended first. At 11 a.m. on November 11, 1918, the guns fell silent. And for the first time in 4 years, the sky over Europe became quiet. No engines, no gunfire, no flames, only wind. Pilots sat on their wings, staring at the air as if waiting for something to appear, an enemy, a friend, a purpose. But the sky remained empty. The war had ended not with a final aerial victory, but with a kind of stunned absence. The machines settled, the pilots exhaled, the world took its first breath of peace. But the sky was not the same sky that existed before 1914. It had been forged, scorched, redefined. The Great War had given it the fighter, the bomber, the reconnaissance doctrine, the tactical airstrike, the night raid, the anti-air network, the synchronized machine gun, the idea that the air could shape the fate of nations. These inventions were not ornaments, they were seeds. Seeds planted high above the ruined fields of Europe, waiting for the next storm to make them bloom. When the armistice silenced the trenches on November 11, 1918, the world exhaled, unevenly, uncertainly, as if the air itself might reject peace. But above the mud, the ruins, the burned forests, another silence lingered, the silence of the sky, emptied of engines for the first time in years. For 4 years, Europe had lived under a canopy of noise. Propellers, machine guns, bombs, balloons, shouting observers, the metallic scream of dive and stall. Now the heavens were blank again, yet they were not innocent. They would never be innocent again. This was the final legacy of the Great War, Humanity had taught the sky to remember violence. In those first quiet weeks, the pilots returned to Earth like ghosts unsure where they belonged. Some were greeted as heroes, some slipped into anonymity, some wandered, restless, nostalgic, unable to fit into a world that felt too slow, too grounded. The infantry had their trenches to explain their trauma. The artillerymen had their deafness. But the pilots had only memories, and memories are invisible. A French aviator wrote, "The sky was my home. Now it is a place I can no longer enter. I do not know where my life now resides." Their wounds were not on their bodies, they were in altitude. Nations, exhausted by loss, tried to make sense of what the air war had meant. In Britain, the Royal Air Force remained proudly independent, a symbol that something new had been born. In France, airfields lay full of grounded Spads, lined like museum relics along muddy runways. In Germany, aviators stepped into a nation that had collapsed beneath them, their once proud air service dissolved by treaty and humiliation. The sky had shown them glory, history showed them consequences. Yet beneath all the mourning and demobilization, the war had reshaped humanity's relationship with altitude. Before 1914, flight was a novelty. After 1918, it was destiny. People who had never seen an airplane before the war now saw the world through its logic. Distance felt smaller, borders felt thinner. The earth seemed less dominant. Even rural villagers, who once viewed the sky as a place for clouds and God, had learned to scan it for danger, to distinguish the rumble of friendly aircraft from hostile ones, to interpret the geometry of contrails and shadows. Children drew airplanes in their notebooks. Newspapers published photographs of aces like demigods. The idea of the sky changed, from myth to geography, from mystery to arena, a transformation irreversible and profound. But the legacy was not merely technological or cultural, it was psychological. The Great War had revealed a terrible truth. If the sky can be used for observation, it can be used for killing. If for killing, then for terror. If for terror, then for domination. The air war began as reconnaissance. It ended as strategy. From balloons to bombers, from pistols to synchronized guns, from scouting to night raids, the progression had been fast, almost impatient. Humanity had taken 10,000 years to master the earth. It had taken only 4 years to turn the sky into a battlefield. And that speed frightened the thoughtful. A British philosopher wrote after the war, "We have opened a door into a new element, but we do not know how to close it." He was right. There was irony too, sharp, bitter, unforgettable, because the aviators of 1914 to 1918 had believed, many of them sincerely, that they were fighting in a cleaner war, a war above the mud, a war without rot, without poison, without rats, without drowning. But the sky had its own horrors, and unlike the trenches which were confined to a line, the air was infinite. A prelate could not hide, a pilot could not dig, a pilot could not retreat. He could only climb, into danger, into fire, into thin air where breath itself became a privilege. The irony of their war was simple. They flew to escape the earth, yet found a death more absolute. And still, amid all the violence, something miraculous had happened in the sky. Something contradictory, something eternal. The aviators of 1914 to 1918 had glimpsed beauty unimaginable to the soldiers below. Sunlight breaking across cloud tops, dawn blooming in layers of gold and ash, moonlit wings above a sleeping front, silence so pure it felt like absolution. It was this tension, this coexistence of magnificence and horror that defined the air war's soul. One pilot wrote on the eve of the armistice, "I have lived in 2 worlds, one was hell, the other was heaven, and the same wings carried me between them." That sentence became the epitaph of his generation. By 1919, the world had begun to rebuild, factories reopened, trams moved again, cities swept away rubble, farmers reclaimed churned earth. The sky watched in quiet stillness, but something lingered above, not smoke, not wreckage, but knowledge. Knowledge of what altitude could do, knowledge of what engines could unleash, knowledge that the next war, if it came, would begin not in the trenches but in the clouds. This was the final irony of the Great War's air revolution. The very machines built to break stalemate had broken a boundary instead. The boundary between earth and sky, the boundary between war and apocalypse, the boundary between the world that was and the world that would come. And so the air war of the First World War ends, not with a final dogfight, nor with a final bombing raid, but with a question. Now that humanity had mastered the sky, what would it become? In 1918, no one knew the answer. But the sky did. Because once the heavens have been taught violence, they do not forget it. And once mankind has tasted altitude, he is never satisfied with peace on the ground. The Great War ended. The sky did not. End of the story.